Okay, so now we're going to turn to Hanukkah. And Hanukkah, you've probably heard of. It's pretty well known. The word Hanukkah itself means dedication. And it refers to the rededication of the Jerusalem temple after the Maccabees reconquered it from Hellenistic Jews and the Syrian Greeks. It was really as much a civil war between pietist traditional Jews and Hellenized Jews as it was a war with the outside powers of the Seleucid Empire based in Syria, which is a Greek empire but based in Syria. It's not really fighting Syrians. And when the temple was rededicated, according to the books of Maccabees and according to Josephus, they decreed an 8-day dedication festival. In year one. So what does that say? Well, it says that the story of the lights is invented many years later. There's no mention of the miracle of the light lasting for 8 days in Josephus or in the books of the Maccabees. Rather, it appears in the Talmud many centuries later as a way to undercut the Maccabees and emphasize the power of the god. The Maccabees themselves explain why it was 8 days, either because it was like Sukkot out of season, which is an 8-day festival, or it's like the original Hanukkah, the original dedication of the original Jerusalem temple, which in the Book of Kings in the Hebrew Bible is described as an 8-day festival decreed by King Solomon. So it's either Sukkot out of season or it's rededicating the temple a la Solomon, but it was 8 days from the get-go without any miracle. And the miracle story shows up much later. Now, the next two words you see on the list are related to each other, menorah and Chanukiah. Now, the way they're related is that every Chanukiah is a menorah, but not every menorah is a Chanukiah. Menorah comes from the word ner. Ner means candle or light. So a menorah is a candelabra, right? Even the word candelabra, we have the word candle in it. Is there a specific number of candles you need for a candelabra? No. So in theory, you could have a menorah that was 4 lights or 5 lights because it's full of nerot, it's full of candles. However, the conventional image of the menorah that used to stand in Jerusalem in the temple was 7 lights. 7 days of the week, right? 7's a magic number for the priest. So the original menorah had 7 lights on it. If you've seen a Shabbat service at Kol Hadash, you know that we use a 7-candled menorah. That's part of that tradition. And it's also part of the seal of the modern state of Israel, this 7-candled menorah with all of the candles at the same level, because it's about the 7 days of the week. It's not about the Hanukkah story. Now, a Chanukiah is a menorah, but it's the term that's generally used among Sephardic Jews to differentiate them so that it in fact has 8 lights, 4 usually, with one other candle that's elevated or marked off as separate. It could be, by the way, 8 in a row and then 1 in front or 1 off to the side. It doesn't have to be 4 and 4 with 1 up in the middle. The idea is that you have 8 that are the same level and 1 that's set apart from the others. And the 8 lights are lit 1 light, 2 light, 3 lights all the way through the 8-day holiday. Although actually every night you're lighting 2 lights, 3 lights, 4 lights because you have this other candle that's called the shamus. You'll see that word near the bottom of that column. The shamus is the helper candle that you light at the beginning. I'll talk a little bit more about the shamus in a minute. So you understand the difference between menorah and Chanukiah, that a menorah is simply a candelabra, but often with 7 lights on one level, where the Chanukiah is a special kind of menorah for Hanukkah with 8 lights at the same level traditionally and 1 light separately. There was a debate actually among rabbinic Jews over whether you should light 8 and then count down to 1 by the number of days left in the holiday, or should you light 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and get brighter and brighter. They ultimately decided, along with to follow the teaching of the House of Hillel, to start small and grow bigger because you want to make it brighter and brighter. You promote in goodness, as they say. Now, the Maccabees, which is the 4th word on that list, were the family famously connected to the Hanukkah revolution against the Greeks, the rebellion against this outside cultural influence that wanted to bring in the gymnasium and naked athletics and sacrifices of pigs on the altar and worshiping multiple gods and praying to the emperor and all kinds of terrible stuff. Of course, what happened after the Maccabees conquered Jerusalem and Judea and actually other peoples was they took it too far in multiple senses. They conquered a people called the Idumeans and forcibly converted them to Judaism. They took over the temple and made themselves high priests. They weren't from the high priestly family. They noticed in Egypt you could be both a religious official and a king. So now they made themselves kings. Well, you couldn't be a king and a priest. Those are totally different tribes in the 12-tribe system in the Bible. And then they did the worst thing of all. They themselves became Hellenized because Greek culture was so interesting. They simply could not stay away. And so while they started out with wonderful Hebrew names like Yehudah, Judah, and Mattatyahu, Mattathias, after a couple generations, they were Hyrcanos and Aristobulus and even Alexander. Well, once you become Alexander, you've given up the ghost. And the books of Maccabees themselves are written in Greek, despite the fact that the Maccabees were trying to, be anti-Greek for the point of the rebellion. Now, the next word down is dreidel. And a dreidel is a four-sided top that has four letters on it. Nes Gadol Haya Sham is what most people think those letters mean. A great miracle happened there. But I remember growing up hearing that when the Greeks were punishing the Jews before the Maccabean rebellion, the Jews used the playing of dreidel to disguise the fact they were studying Torah. But if you thought about it, what would their dreidels have said? Because this is before the miracle of the lights. Would it have said a great miracle will happen there? Like prophetic tops? Well, actually, the dreidel is related to a German medieval game called Teetotum, which has a four-sided top and four letters on it in the Latin alphabet, N, G, H, and S. Just like Nun, Gimel, He, Shin. And those letters in German meant nicht, nothing, Ganze, the whole thing, halb, half, and stell, ein, put one in. So originally, these were the Yiddish rules for the game. And that's how we play it today. A nun, nothing. Gimel, you get the whole thing. The Ganze, right? Hey, you get halb, half. Shin, stelline, put one in. So it's a much later innovation. More like medieval period and borrowing from surrounding cultures. It definitely does not date back to the Maccabees. And it was later on that someone came up with that clever saying of a great miracle happened there. Or in Israel now, you get them with Nun, Gimel, Hey, and a Pei. The Pei means Po. A great miracle happened here. So they've even changed the dreidel in Israel to match their geographic location. Now, it's customary during Passover to eat foods that were cooked in oil. And I have two of them here. One is a sufganiyah, or a jelly donut, that is very popular in Sephardic Jewish communities. And the other is a latke, which is a potato pancake. Although they made latkes out of other things before the potato made it to Europe. You have to remember the potato doesn't make it to Europe until after the conquest of Mesoamerica, starting, 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So before 1500, there were no potato latkes because there were no potatoes where Jews were living. So they made it out of something else, leeks or other kinds of tuber vegetables. In any case, just an interesting side note that the potato latke is not what Moses ate, but that goes back forever. Okay, I mentioned shamas earlier. The word shamas itself is related to the word shamash in Hebrew, which is related to the word shemesh. Shemesh is the sun. Now, what does the sun have to do with what's happening at Hanukkah time? Guess what it looks like outside? It's dark. In fact, Hanukkah takes place at the end of a moon cycle. It starts on the 25th of the month of Kislev, which is the month closest to the winter solstice. So what that means is it's the longest night because, again, there's no moon near the end of a Jewish month. Full moon at the beginning, new moon beginning of the next month. Sorry, full moon at the middle, new moon at the beginning of the next month. So by the end of the month, it's the end of the moon cycle. It's getting darker and darker and darker at night. So you take the longest night that's connected to the least moon, and that's when Hanukkah starts. And it starts at night. So what you need is to take the shemesh or the shamas, the light of the sun, and then help it to burn brighter. And the next day to burn twice as bright. And then the next day to burn 50% more brightly. And the next day to add 4 lights, and then 5 lights, and then 6 lights. So you're sort of encouraging the sun to burn brighter, burn brighter, burn brighter. And lo and behold, every year it works. So the shamas, as the helper candle lighting the others, is like the shemesh, the sun, helping the sun, mini sun helping the big sun to burn brighter by adding lights. Okay, next word down is Tu B'Shvat. This is the next holiday in the Jewish calendar after Hanukkah, and actually it doesn't appear directly in the Hebrew Bible at all. They don't mention Tu B'Shvat. It appears in the rabbinic discussion of holidays. It's referred to as the New Year for trees. They actually describe 4 New Years in the Hebrew Bible: a calendar New Year on the first day of the month that is Passover because of the Leviticus 23 calendar. There's the New Year for kings, and there's a New Year for the counting, and that's Rosh Hashanah today. And this is the New Year for trees. It means it's the point of the year where you declare a tree is 1 year older, because who can keep track of all the birthdays of all the trees that are out there? Sort of like horses. Horses' age is defined by what year they were born in. They don't keep track of all the birth dates of all the horses to track if they're a yearling or a 2-year-old or whatever. So Tu B'Shvat is similar. Now, the name Tu B'Shvat is actually really boring in the Hebrew. It means the 15th of Shavat. That's all it is. It's sort of like that old joke. Do they have the 4th of July in France? And the answer is yes. And the 5th of July, and the 6th of July, and the 7th. They have the day, the 4th of July. It's just not a holiday, right? So there's the 15th of every month, but not every month has the 15th as a holiday. Some do. The 15th of the fall month of Tishrei is Sukkot. The 15th of Shavat is a holiday called the 15th of Shavat, but it's not particularly distinct by just calling it the 15th of Shavat. So Tu B'Shvat is a holiday where you're celebrating trees, but you're celebrating also this new moon the full moon that's appearing on the 15th of the month. It's become a holiday to celebrate fruits and fruitfulness. Beginning in the Middle Ages, mystics in the town of Sfat in northern Israel would have a special seder of different colors of wine and different kinds of fruits, some fruits that were hard on the outside but soft on the inside, or soft on the inside, hard on the inside and soft on the outside, and some others that you could eat all the way through, like a fig or a carob. And the idea was you would explore different aspects of your personality or connections to the outside world through these different symbols and styles of wine that you would eat, and also study texts at the same time. Today, Tu B'Shvat is sort of an environmental holiday. It's a tree planting holiday in Israel. It was connected to the Jewish National Fund's effort to raise funds to plant trees in Israel. Not always in the best way, but with at least a good, positive intention of planting trees. And nowadays, it's become a kind of Jewish Earth Day to think about environmental causes. That'll actually be happening in just a couple of weeks as we are recording this in January. The next holiday listed is Purim. And Purim is like Carnival. It happens around the same time of year, actually, as Carnival does, and it has a similar kind of flavor to it, where it's a kind of transgressive holiday, where you might wear different clothes, you might dress up as one of the characters from the Purim story, which is based on the scroll of Esther that you'll find in the Hebrew Bible. You sometimes drink to excess. There's an old saying that you're supposed to drink so much that you can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Mordecai and Haman. So you're supposed to curse Haman, who's the villain of the story, and you're supposed to praise Mordecai, but you're also supposed to get so drunk you can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman. You're just going most of the time. Now, Purim is thought to be this very uplifting holiday because the story in the book of Esther is a story of diaspora Jews under threat, about to be destroyed, and then saved by the courage of Esther, who goes to the king and reveals that she was secretly Jewish when she married him. And then the Jews are saved by her courage and Mordecai's courage in encouraging her to be brave. So it's a day that was going to be terrible and became a day of celebration, according to the story. By the way, there's actually a connection between Yom Kippur and Purim. Remember, the name Yom Kippur in the Hebrew Bible was Yom Kippurim, plural. And so the rabbi said, what does this mean? Well, they imagined that in the days of the Messiah and the days of the rebuilding of the temple and everything being put on its proper spiritual plane, that Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, will become a Yom Kippurim, a day like Purim, a day of rejoicing, because we have no sins. And so it's a very different kind of world post-redemption. It's a Yom Kippur becomes a Yom Kippurim, a day like Purim. Literally, Purim, by the way, means lots or dice, because in the story, Haman throws the dice to decide what's the day to destroy the Jews, and so it's the dice or the Purim that set the date for the holiday. Now, there's a lot of traditions around the observance of Purim. I have 5 of them listed here. The top one is called Mishloach Manot, the tradition of sending gifts. Mishloach is to send, manot are gifts, sending gifts to your neighbors and to the poor. It's the idea of, make little gift baskets. So sometimes people bake cookies or raisins, sweet fruits, that kind of thing. So you send gifts to your neighbors and gifts to the poor. That's a tradition connected to Purim. And this is described directly in the book of Esther, the prescription to do this. So you can find biblical source for that. The second one down is a Yiddish phrase, Purim spiel. And this means the Purim play or the Purim telling of the story. What's your spiel? What's your story? Well, the telling of the Purim story is not just the reading of the scroll. It's actually sometimes the acting out of the story. And sometimes you would have men dressed up as women in this performance. And that was, again, one of those like carnival transgressive kind of moments. You would sometimes make fun of people in your telling of the Purim stories. You'd have a very thinly disguised representation of the king or the local duke or the local rabbi. There's a reason why rabbis did not like Purim spiels, because they did not like being made fun of periodically in the calendar. But the tradition of the Purim spiel is one of those bases for Jewish theater that goes back many centuries. The third word down is Megillah. Megillah means scroll, but it's often meant as specifically referring to the Megillat Esther, or the scroll of Esther. You read the Megillah, you read the story of Esther from a special scroll. It's like a one-pole scroll. You know how Torah's scrolls have 2? This is a one-pole scroll, and it has the full 10 chapters of the book of Esther. But sometimes, in modern English even, we'll say, don't give me the whole Megillah. I don't need the whole story. I don't want the whole thing. But the Megillah literally means a scroll, often referred to as the scroll of Esther. And by the way, Megillot were sometimes beautifully decorated and, it had illuminations, depictions of what's happening in the story around the text. We actually made our own versions of a Purim Megillah for our Sunday school, where our students decorated around the text. And so now we have these full-scale decorated Megillot that our Sunday school has made. Grogger is the Yiddish term for a noisemaker. It's also the Hebrew word rashan, same idea, making noise. The idea is you use that grogger to drown out the name of Haman. It's like booing, but with extra loud noise. And finally, the last term related to Purim we have here is Hamantash. Now, people have heard the word Hamantash. I will say the plural of Hamantash is not Hamantashes. It's a Yiddish/German word, so the plural is Hamantashen. So one Hamantash, many Hamantashen. But what does it mean? Well, people often think it means Haman's ears, because in Hebrew it's Oznei Haman, the ears of Haman, as if he were a Vulcan or Romulan or something with pointy ears. Some people think it is Haman's hat, that he had a 3-pointed hat, like a colonial era someone, I don't know. But it's not Haman's hat, and it's not Haman's pocket. It's not Haman's ear, rather. It helps to know some German. The word Tash means a pocket. So you could say Haman's pockets, but it's actually related to the word for poppy seed, or Mon. Mon in German is poppy seed. Tash is pocket. So a Montash is a poppy seed pocket. And then somebody at some point made a clever dad joke and called it a Hamontash. It's a Haman pocket. And so then it became the Hamantash, as we think of it, with the 3 corners and the fruit of some kind in the middle, even though people sometimes still make it with poppy seeds in the original fashion. Okay, moving on. We are at 25 minutes to 9, so hopefully we can get through these last ones in time efficiently. All right. Pesach. Pesach is the Hebrew word for Passover, but it's also the word for the lamb sacrifice. Remember, I mentioned that that used to be the first month of the year, the spring, when you counted the calendar from the spring instead of from the fall. And there were actually two rituals that were observed in the spring. You had the offering of the firstborn lambs that were called the Pesach offering, and you had a holiday around eating unleavened bread and cleaning out all the old grain from your properties. And that was a holiday called matzot, or unleavened breads, plural. So you had two traditions: the farmers that used grain and made matzah, and the shepherds who had lambs and sacrificed the firstborn lambs as a sign of fertility for the future. Those holidays ultimately became combined into what we today call Pesach or Passover, and had the story of the Exodus added to it as part of the ritual. But originally they were agricultural holidays that were separate and later were combined. The idea of observing a special Seder or festival meal with foods in a certain order and prayers recited in a certain order, that's what we today call a Seder. Seder means order in Hebrew. So the festival meal that's connected to Passover is eaten in a certain order and with certain texts that are read, and the idea of order is the basis for the name that it acquired called a Seder. The prototype of the Seder is described in the Mishnah, this early collection of rabbinic sayings, so we know it goes back a long, long time. There's even a description in parts of the books of Exodus that say that you're supposed to eat the Passover sacrifice done at the temple in Jerusalem with matzah and maror, or bitter herbs. So the idea of eating the food in a certain fashion, in a ritual way, goes back even long before the rabbis, probably to 500 BCE or earlier, that this was an ancient ritual of eating the food in a certain way, but having that roasted lamb as a core part of the ritual, and having the matzah, the unleavened bread, as part of the ritual too. The idea that you have the Pesach with matzah and maror, that's all part of that original recipe for a Seder. Now, the opposite of matzah, or unleavened bread, is chametz. Chametz means leavened bread. This is interpreted by the rabbis to be any kind of bread that has had water in it, other than a minimal amount of time. That's why you have to bake matzah very fast once you've added the water. They're worried it might start to leaven, to grow. And this is a universal prohibition on Jews across varieties of ethnic cultures to not have any chametz during the holiday. However, there are some debates over other kinds of foods. Rice and beans, for example, are allowed for Sephardic or Middle Eastern Jews, but they are not allowed for Ashkenazi Jews historically, because the concern was that you might mix up the wheat with the rice, and then you've got chametz in with your rice, and it's treif for Passover. It's not kosher for Passover if you have that chametz. There's also ways of working around chametz. You can today get a kosher for Passover chocolate cake that tastes pretty good. And you might say, what's the point? Isn't the point deprivation? No. The point is following the letter of the law, just like those Shabbat timers. For some people, it's chametz workarounds, and they manage to have their chocolate cake and observe Passover too. Okay, top of the next column, we have charoset. Charoset is understood to reflect the mortar that was used to build the pyramids under the slavery in Egypt. Remember, the story of Passover in the Hebrew Bible and the Torah is of the Jews as slaves in Egypt, and they were saved by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm by the Hebrew god Yahweh, who inflicted 10 plagues on the Egyptians and the whole Passover Megillah, although it's not a Megillah, it's called a Haggadah instead. But the charoset is supposed to reflect the mortar that was used to build it, but that can be made with different foods. Most Ashkenazi European Jews will use apples and wine and sometimes raisins, but you can also find date-based charoset that are more popular in the Middle East, and other bases for the charoset. There's many ways to make it. The next phrase down is the 4 questions, which are actually 5 questions, because you have a general question of why is this night different from all other nights? And then you have a series of questions exploring that. Why in this night do we dip twice? in a ritual way instead of never dipping at all, like most nights? Why on all other nights do we eat sitting or reclining, and tonight we have to recline? Why on all other nights do we eat all kinds of greens? Today we eat bitter herbs, and so on. Now, these are ritual questions that have ritual answers to them. So on one level, it celebrates the Jewish tradition of asking questions. On the other level, it says you're only allowed to ask these questions and not other questions. So, there's that freedom and limitation inherent in Jewish tradition. It's also worth noting, historically, the four questions were different. When the temple stood in Jerusalem, you didn't ask a reclining question, and instead you asked, why on all other nights do we eat either boiled or roasted meat, but tonight we eat only roasted meat? And they didn't ask the question about reclining. But after the temple had been destroyed 200 years, 300 years, 400 years before, that meat question didn't make sense anymore because you weren't eating the sacrifice from the temple. And Jews had assimilated enough into Greco-Roman culture that the idea of reclining at a feast became very popular. And so they shifted and changed the wording of the questions, took out the roasted meat question, and put it instead the reclining question into those four questions. The next word down is maror. That's the bitter herb I mentioned before. Mar itself is sort of bitter. That's the sort of adjective. So maror are the bitter herbs. Most people today use horseradish to do that, although you can use other varieties. I know some families that have both Jewish and Japanese heritage use wasabi as their bitter herb because it's certainly got a kick to it. Although I will point out that most wasabi served in America is actually horseradish colored green, because real wasabi is very tricky to manage. I've even heard that a good chunk of the wasabi served in Japan is horseradish because it's a lot easier to manage than actual wasabi. And then the last Passover term we have here is karpas. Karpas is the term for the greens. The parsley is often what we use on the Seder plate. And remember, on the Seder plate, you've got this design with all these different symbolic foods on it. You've got a place for the charoset, a place for the maror, for the bitter herbs, a place for the karpas, for the greens, a place for an egg that's there, celebrating the festival sacrifice that used to be offered at that time of year. Modern Seder plates have other symbols too. They've included an orange to include Jewish diversity of gender and sexual identities. You've got some people actually put a piece of pita bread on their plate to symbolize the virtue of transgression. You've got pomegranates on some plates to celebrate intermarriage. You've got tomatoes or grapes to celebrate farmers. You've got and so on and so on. Olives to remember the oppression of Palestinians. You can find all kinds of creative symbols. You almost need two Seder plates for all the symbols that have been incorporated into the Seder plate. Okay, our last few terms here. Oh, I missed one at the bottom on the second column of Haggadah. That's the book that you read during Passover that has the story of the Exodus and the miracles of God in a traditional version, or an emphasis on the importance of self-saving, of helping others to save themselves in a more humanistic flavor. Okay, to finish up our words on the right, Lag BaOmer, this is again one of those not so creative titles. Lag simply means 33. It's the 33rd day of counting the wheat sheaves. You count the first night of Passover. That's when you count number 1 on the Omer. And you count all the way up to 50 because you're supposed to count 7 weeks to the next holiday. So the 33rd day is Lag BaOmer. It's sort of an intermission in this counting because it allows you to get your hair cut and to do some other, get married and do some other things you're not allowed to do when you're counting the Omer from the beginning of Passover to the next holiday, which we'll talk about in a second. And it's also been connected with the story of Rabbi Akiva and Jewish oppression, but also the courage to study Torah. There are bonfires that are sometimes lit on Lag BaOmer in Israel. Again, it just simply means the 33rd day of the counting of the wheat sheaves, the Omer, but it has taken on a symbolism of its own. And then that holiday that happens at 50 days, Shavuot, is an echo of an ancient Jewish calendar. Shavuot literally means weeks, because the Bible says you count 7 weeks from Shabbat, or from the beginning of Passover, as the rabbis interpreted it. And then on the 50th day, because remember, 7 weeks is 7 times 7, 49 days. On the 50th day, you mark this special festival of weeks and you do a special harvest holiday. This is that summer harvest holiday, remember? Chag Katsir, the first fruits that you gather. This is the holiday of Shavuot, 50 days after Passover. But Shavuot got a new meaning from the rabbis who decided to assign the giving of the Torah, both the written and the oral Torah, which the rabbis used to run Jewish life. They assigned that to have happened on Shavuot, on the Festival of Weeks. So Shavuot became a festival of celebrating the Torah, not just the harvest, which helped when Jews were not farmers, by and large, for most of their history. There were certainly Jewish farmers, but most of them were not. And so a farming holiday of celebrating the first fruits didn't work for them. But a Torah holiday, that worked because they had Torahs and they had synagogues. The other thing that's fascinating about Shavuot is there used to be a holiday calendar today it's called the Jubilee calendar, because it's found in the book of Jubilees. But it was also called the septennial calendar, or the seven-based calendar, because it divided the Jewish calendar by the number 7. You have 7 days in a week. You have 7 weeks in a cycle, plus a closing 50th day, just like Shavuot. That's 50 days. If you have 7 cycles of that, you've got 350 days. You had a spring New Year festival of 7 days, a fall harvest festival of 7 days, and then a New Year atonement day. So again, spring harvest of 7, fall harvest of 7, and 1 atonement New Year day. You've got 365 days. You've got a solar calendar, more or less. And so the calendar in Jubilees, or the calendar of the septennial system, is echoed in Shavuot. It's the only echo we have aside from Shabbat. But both Shabbat and Shavuot reflect that 7-based calendar that one group of Jews, the group that wrote and organized the Dead Sea Scrolls and that community, they probably ran by that 7-based calendar. So it was an option in Jewish life, separate from the rabbis. The next one down is called Tisha B'Av. This is a holiday that occurs during the summer, usually in August, and it marks the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Again, a non-creative name that simply means the 9th of Av. And it was actually an invented holiday because the Bible disagrees on what day the temple was actually destroyed. In one book, it says it was destroyed on the 7th of the 9th month. In another book, it says it was destroyed on 10th month, rather. And in another book, it says it was destroyed on the 10th of that month. Well, was it destroyed on the 7th or destroyed on the 10th? Pick a day in the middle. So the rabbis observe the 9th of Av as a day of mourning, a reading of the book of Lamentations, which is a Hebrew Bible book that describes the destruction of the temple. And it's a day of fasting, another fast day. There's actually a lot of Jewish fast days. And this is why I don't like the joke that says all Jewish holidays are, they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. First of all, a number of Jewish holidays are fast days where you don't eat. So maybe they tried to kill us, and maybe they failed, but we don't eat on all those holidays. And some of the holidays we observe, they succeeded in killing us, like Tisha B'Av. So they succeeded in killing us, and we don't eat. Yom Kippur is a fast day. And if anyone's trying to kill us on Yom Kippur, it's God. So what does that mean for the pattern? You see, that pattern of they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat, fit the holidays that most Jews observe. It works for Hanukkah. They tried to kill us, they failed, we eat. It works for Passover. The Egyptians tried to kill us, they failed, we eat. It even works for Purim. Haman wanted to kill us, he failed, let's eat. But it doesn't work for most Jewish holidays. Doesn't work for Rosh Hashanah. Doesn't work for Shabbat. Okay. So let's retire that joke and learn what's really in about the Jewish holidays. Now, these last 3 holidays are holidays that were actually instituted by the modern state of Israel in recent times because they reflect modern Jewish history. The first one, Yom HaAtzmaut, is Israeli Independence Day. It's marked on the Jewish calendar in Israel. The date on the general calendar is actually marked by Palestinians as what they call Nakba Day, or Catastrophe Day. So they mark the 14th of May. The Jews mark the 8th of Iyar in the Jewish calendar. So they sometimes coincide, but they often don't. Yom HaZikaron is Israeli Memorial Day. And interestingly, Israel has its Memorial Day to fallen soldiers the day before Independence Day. Imagine if our Memorial Day were July 3rd instead of in May. It would be much more important than a time for mattress sales and, parades. There are still places in the country that take Memorial Day very seriously. They go to military cemeteries and take it very seriously. But if it were a national observance the day before Independence Day, I think it would have a real different resonance to it. And then finally, Yom HaShoah is Holocaust Memorial Day. And that was also decreed by the Israeli government. There were debates over what day to mark a Holocaust Memorial Day. Some people wanted to do it on the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion, except that was the first night of Passover, so that would be a problem with the calendar. Or it was April 20th, but that was Hitler's birthday. Maybe that's not a good day for Holocaust Memorial Day. Some people wanted to do it just as part of Tisha B'Av because it's commemorating destruction, and we've got a destruction day. We'll just lump it in with Tisha B'Av as well. Ultimately, the Israeli government settled on a date in between Passover and Shavuot, and they were able to set a day for Holocaust Memorial observance that has become very broadly observed to mark the disaster, the heroism, and the importance of memory. Any last questions on any of those before we wrap up? I know it was a whirlwind tour through these terms related to Jewish holidays, but hopefully you learned something new about stuff you've heard before. And this is another opportunity to deepen your knowledge of Jewish life by either adding vocabulary or by adding new vocabulary to your repertoire. Any last comments or questions?
Did not know a lot of that. So
Okay, great.